All right, welcome to the review for Antioch Chronicles Episode 3. During the recording of this review, which happened immediately following the recording of the final mission, there wasn't really much of a start or end point to the point where we talked about the review and the point where we talked about the rest of the campaign, so I just sort of slapped it in here, and we're just going to get right into it from that recording. So here you go. Enjoy.
Wow, so what are your thoughts on this campaign, this project?
I actually think it was less internally consistent than Annihilation.
Oh, well, seeing as I didn't have any experience with any of these other campaigns, I guess I can really only compare it to Wings of Liberty and Heat of the Swarm.
Yeah, well, I think just looking at it as a comparison to other, like the official content, and I don't know, I don't really see much of a difference in the writing department. I guess it's less focused than those campaigns, but
well, that's because of the multilinear structure of it.
Yeah,
in the middle, towards the end, it's more
this
consistent.
whole midsection really should have just been a linear thing. Yeah, I guess the reason why they wanted to do that is so it would draw a C, which is their fucking logo. They're like a little moon, but that's a pretty dumb reason to fucking destroy the entire structure of the story.
I don't know.
I know that's not actually the reason. It just looks really silly to me that this is the case. Because you needed to complete three Terran missions, 2 Kali Protoss missions. And okay. We got end, boys.
We got end, man. Oh, shit. Yeah, the writing, I mean, it was evident from the get-go that there isn't a strong writer in the StarCraft community. And especially when you're basing it on something that obviously wasn't your original creation to begin with.
Yeah, but they really destroyed the source. Nanoth Tyradun was never really positioned to be an antagonist in the first 2 campaigns, so it really comes out of left field, unless you're like, I guess maybe if you like really consumed a lot of the tertiary media that was created, like if you went around and looked at like the fucking Antioch comics that they made while they were waiting for the 3rd game to be done, and that never happened.
People are completely creatively bankrupt when they start making comics out of something. That is like the utter death knell of a franchise is when they start throwing it into comics, because it's like this desperate callback to say, look, we're nerds. We like comics. You like comics? We like comics. Well, nerds. It's so old school.
Auspex Termalis is actually like that. He ran like a web series or web comic for quite a while after Antioch, so he actually has
that
experience
explains
with that,
so much. That really just goes in line with everything I just said.
I feel like it's
because this is his baby. Why didn't he try to put some effort into the voice acting? Like towards the end, some of the lines were okay, but so much of this really hinged on his performance because Termalis is the lead character, and I told him when the first takes were taken that it doesn't sound convincing. And he just got defensive about it instead of actually like thinking about it, I guess. I don't know if it's an accent thing where his accent just sounds like that. Because I'm not really knowledgeable in accents. If it's an accent thing, it probably just sounds ridiculous to him. He probably has no idea what I'm talking about. But then you compare it to the rest of the character dialogue, which, as far as the Protoss is concerned, most of them are usually, around the point where you want them to be in terms of the diction and the tone. And then his is just completely isolated from them. And I would have thought that, especially after it's said and done, that he really was interested in it. He would have looked at it and seen that inconsistency between them and tried to make it more in line, but of course that never happened. And to me, I mean, not having experienced the other projects, I went through some samples from them. I considered them incomprehensibly bad for StarCraft 1. Your stream just exploded.
Yeah, well, I figure we're done with that. I'm still recording, obviously, but...
Okay. And is like, so I don't know anything about his past things, but it's been years since then. And I don't think he's done any voice acting since then. So maybe he's just like out of practice, which I can understand because I haven't done too much voicing and I'm out of practice and I probably wouldn't do a good performance either. But the lines, like for example, the biggest example I can immediately think of is when we were talking about the fucking Treant mission, the Night Elf mission. And they're faced with this thing that's supposed to be really horrible, and they're supposed to be really dejected and offended about it. And he's just doesn't give two shits. Just really doesn't care. It's so much that is just completely unconvincing. Very, very, very unconvincing. And I mean, like the writing and the dialogue and the everything else aside, I think that as a story, that this was really centralized on him, at least at parts, him contending with that and then overcoming challenges. It never really seems to focus. It always feels unfocused and really confused about what it really wants to actually be about, because we never really get into any given subject enough to actually give as much of a shit about it. Like, for example, Trent / whoever Nova was, they don't ever actually really work to establish that relationship. They just throw it in as like, you should care about this, but we don't care about it because we don't care about the characters. And we probably don't really gain much of a real grounding in that in the other ones either. Even if we did, we don't spend enough time with them in this because we're only given a few missions with them, and most of it's just filled with one-liners that are just there mostly to waste airspace and not really actually build character. So with Termalis, he has more screen time, but we still don't really get into the character at all in terms of like his personality. He's just someone who, I suppose his intonation is supposed to be he acts cool under pressure, but he doesn't. And most of the time, he's just relegated to being largely inconsequential as far as the actual plot progression is concerned. He doesn't take initiative, so he just kind of is there, even though he is most certainly a centerpiece. And at the same time, other characters relegate to him for direction, but the way his lines are delivered, he doesn't sound like he's actually, deserving of that. He doesn't sound decisive at all. Even when he's quote-unquote acting cool under pressure, if that's really their intent, it's hard to tell. The fact you can't even tell what their intent is at the end of campaign just really leads to a lot of confusion. I think that Auspex most certainly could have done some retakes and focused on that, but I don't think he was in an environment that really encouraged him to do so, especially since his first reaction was to cry when I told him about it. And I realized that they're trying to stay, canon to the original material and trying to replicate the original material, but that doesn't mean you can't add some emotion to your character's dialogue when they're faced with extreme circumstances and life and death situations, especially involving characters that were once your lifelong friends and stuff like that.
I think that this really hinges on the idea that all of these stories, and I think this is a problem that plagued the original Antioch, the original StarCraft campaign, as well as obviously StarCraft 2, they follow this very rigid and small-scale constrained narrative that forces you to experience stuff from a certain number of perspectives, a limited scale that makes it so that there's never really any justification for having large-scale battles with allied AI and having it be more than just like a 1v1 or some weird like 1vx scenario where everybody's allied against you. Like, I don't think there was a single free-for-all section besides you could argue that me attacking some of the Protoss units in that Protoss installation map we needed a free-for-all at some point, but it's like it's always just like 1v1 or something like that. And the only large-scale battle that we actually saw in the entirety of this campaign was that insane laggy map, really. That's like the only thing that was large scale at all. And that was so large scale to the point where it was like, it threw the baby out with the bathwater and just made it so that you're literally having a battle where almost 10,000 units die. It's like the amount of damage, the amount of resources and lives lost is so catastrophic that would be like, at least compared to what we have seen before and compared to what we see after, that seems like something that would result in like all factions immediately just surrendering or something because not being able to just support themselves. Like how could they possibly rebuild after something like that when, you know, you lose like 200 units in the average map otherwise? And it's just so absurd and unbelievable. And logistics are obviously a problem here because like something that's very rarely addressed is the idea that like, oh, I built this barracks with my one SCV and now I can build, you know, 200 Marines if I want to out of it. Like that's something that is never addressed by any RTS lore from StarCraft, at least. Like no campaign really tries to do it. Like Zerg obviously have a little bit of a cop out since they can, or it's not really a cop out. I guess it's fine that they have larvae that spawn from their hatcheries and then the larvae turn into units. But Protoss seem to like warp units in from elsewhere, so they can have that sort of solution in some cases. But there really is no justification for like the Terran being able to do that. And you know they sort of tried to get around that with 120 supply cap in that one mission that was oddly placed. That felt like it was like you said, a tutorial or something. And I just feel like I don't really know what happened with Antioch. Like it doesn't actually seem like something that logically you would expect it to show based on the early showings that it had with its early missions. You wouldn't logically expect the problems that we saw later on to actually happen. At least I don't think so. I think that I look at this and I think that this is just a complete failure to stay on the ball and be consistent with literally anything. And it's probably just because it was, you know, a team of amateurs, hobbyists, who had this idea in their head that they wanted to make something. Like, I guess they wanted to make a sequel to Antioch. I don't know why they chose that in particular. I don't know why they chose to remaster, quote unquote, the original first two campaigns in StarCraft 2, an inferior engine for RTS gameplay.
It's so bizarre. Like, why would you change something that is perfectly functional and then put all that work into something that is probably going to be dysfunctional within half a year later?
Well,
like,
it wasn't really...
It has no future security in it at all for any project.
Yeah, it's not future-proof at all because the patches will just break shit. And some patches just delete your entire mod folder anyways, so if it's in the middle of development or there's some valuable files, you got to back them up separately from the directory that you need them in order for them to exist in the game, which is really just asinine. I think that, I guess outside of that, the only other thing that I could think of is, I mean, it's worth noting that the first two Antioch campaigns are not actually functional since the AI is just broken in all of them. But outside of the AI being broken in the maps that actually have AI running, I guess, yeah, you could say it's a functional campaign. I mean, it's done, right? So, like, it was, maybe it was more functional in the patch that it shipped, but I don't think so. I think it was just fucked to begin with. The sequel, the remaster rather, in StarCraft 2 did not make them more functional, made them less complete, less feature complete, added MOBA abilities to things for some reason, and it's very puzzling design decisions that actually ended up carrying over and being dominant over the conventional RTS design philosophy. Like the stuff that they added into the first two ended up like being even more potent and more prominent in this particular production. So I mean, I guess they had an idea in mind and they delivered to it, but it feels really, really shitty either way. Like, I just look at it like, you know, under normal circumstances when I play campaigns, one of the things that I try to do is reverse engineer the sort of motivation for the creation of this that the developer had, and try to figure out like what was the developer's intention. And I think you and I have both discussed this on the podcast several times, but like a lot of it comes down to intent. And you know, I don't like micromaps. I think they're really just, even if they're designed quote unquote well, I think that they're by and large chores or boring, you know, or they're clunky because of the system that they're made in, the engine that they're designed in. And I even with all that said, if you want to make micromaps, then make them. Make them well, you know, put effort into them. But I just don't understand why they would go through all the effort to like design all this new UI, which seems functional, you know, it seems to work. And it even seems like above and beyond the UI that I would see in the average campaign and even Blizzard's own UI in many cases. Like it seems actually better than a lot of Blizzard's default UI. And like I have no problems applauding them for that. I just feel like it was used in a very weird way because none of it was consistent with itself. So even if it's in isolation useful and you know, high quality, it still doesn't work as a body when assembled together. And on top of it, you're using it. You're putting all this effort into micro maps that just have gimmicks, and you don't transmit the skills from one map to the next. You don't actually, learn anything useful for how to play. Abilities change dramatically in terms of the number values, which is, of course, they're just steroids. So the only thing that they can do, and like their usefulness is entirely geared around how much numbers they have, as opposed to like a status effect or something. And of course, they're just one-click effects. So it's very generic stuff. But when your abilities suddenly you can store more charges and they cool down faster, or you get 100 bonus shields instead of 50, or 150 instead of 50, like, that vastly changes and morphs engagements in ways that really didn't do before. And now you're suddenly relearning how to do that, but there's also this Titan gimmick at the same time. So it's just stupid. Like, I guess they realized that the ability wasn't useful in the late game because they kept increasing other numbers in a non-linear fashion, and so they had to buff him up, and they wrote some, they sort of reached into their asshole and grabbed out the void mastery excuse, which really is so silly. And there's a lot of tipping in this too. There's so much tip. Like, a lot of tips popped up and expositioned you the way that heroes worked and stuff. So it's just I would describe this campaign's communication as very schizophrenic. I think that it really does not know how it wants to engage with the player. I guess tips were actually consistent, but tips never feel consistent. They never feel good. It doesn't feel good to pause the game after a cutscene or, whatever, and just stop yourself from being able to interact with the game so you can read basically what amounts to a wiki article or a readme on how shit works. Like, that's such a stupid way to explain stuff, and I cannot stress this enough. Like, I really feel like this is one of the worst offenses that the Antioch Chronicles even had, is that it would just explain stuff by forcing you to pause the game and read up on how things worked, because they knew that they didn't even want to put effort into trying to communicate that shit through gameplay or through natural reads.
Indicators.
Yeah, indicators. Well, I don't know, man. I feel like I definitely I can comfortably echo what you said earlier, where you were mentioning the fact that, if they wanted to do the micro maps, which it seems like they wanted to do those more than they wanted to do the macro maps, because they're so afraid of just having basic macro that they have to add in all these gimmicks. I definitely think that they should have stuck with the micro missions if that's what they wanted to do. I think that they probably just threw the macro maps in there as a generic sort of like hand wave away, like, oh yeah, here's the token macro maps so that you can still call this a StarCraft campaign, but it's not a StarCraft campaign, and it really you shouldn't feel pressured into making a StarCraft campaign if you don't want to. If you don't want to make a campaign with any sense of scale, or you want to make the scale, but you want to make it so that it's done through AI allies or something, that could actually be interesting if you still had these engagements. It still felt like StarCraft, but the way that you engaged with the stuff was through well-designed heroes and, some other mechanics or something that were actually implemented properly, instead of just being Babby's first MOBA abilities that steroid you up. So, like, I could see a way where that could actually be useful. That could actually be not over-engineered and not explained through tips. I could see a way where that could actually work. And so it saddens me greatly to see how far this campaign tried to go and how little it actually went in reality. It's very, like I said, it's very schizophrenic. It feels like the way that it explains stuff to you, and you'll never really shake that feeling when you play this. I think you'll never really shake the feeling that the developers didn't really know what the fuck they were doing when it comes to actually communicating the gameplay information. And again, I know, like you were saying, Azure Guy also did a lot of the work, so hopefully he's learned a lot from doing this and comes out. I'm assuming he's coming out of it a more polished developer. But between the fact that this was rushed time-wise and the fact that it's also just really it's just designed in such a silly way, where the only way that they felt they could communicate seems to be through tips, as opposed to being through tips and indicators, as opposed to actual reads and gameplay. Is very unfortunate, and it further contributes to the feeling that you're not actually experiencing a StarCraft project. You're just experiencing some weird pseudo MOBA, micro campaign with a couple of gimmick macro missions stuck in there. That I guess there's also a lot of time padding, and it feels really wasteful of the player's time. Like, I never want to waste people's time. My In Consummate campaign has the first map really sets the wrong impression, because it has a lot of cutscenes that stop game. It has 2 cutscenes that stop gameplay, And I really didn't like that. I wanted to cut down on the cutscenes that opened the map as well, so that was a bit more to the point, and the briefing, so that it was less time before you just started playing, and opened a bit more with just straight up gameplay and characterization to the environment. And that's what I'm trying to do now. But I know what it's like to waste players' time, and I know what that feels like as a developer. It does not feel good for me anyways. It feels like there's so many things that people could do other than play custom content. They could play actual products that were made by quote unquote AAA developers, or indie games, or watch some movies or something. Like, they could be doing stuff that would likely constitute a better experience for them. So the fact that they're bothering to sit down and play your campaign at all, you don't want to waste their time with stupid, padding and unclear communication, and forcing them to stop their game and read, or stop their game and experience a cutscene. There's a lot of just random gameplay pacing interruption that felt really, really not just unorthodox, like just straight up bad. It felt really bad to just get my control yanked away, center view in the middle of that, 7,000 death mission, and all over the fucking place. So that's really my take on this campaign, is that not only was the gameplay communication really schizophrenic and just generally very lazy, very Blizzard, you also had the idea that there's very obvious bugs, like the 3D positional audio. So that there's a lot of really obvious bugs here. You just look at any real screen of the game, you'll see some weird shit happening. And I guess there's really a lot that you could talk about it if you wanted to list off all of the issues with it.
I'm now that I take a piss, because I got a lot I'm going to talk about.
Okay.
Just give me 1 second.
Yeah, I'll take one too.
Okay. So it's 3 a.m. and it's going to be a little hard for me to string all this together coherently, but I'm going to give it a shot. So I don't usually record mods. I don't usually cast custom content. And it's not because I don't like commentary of custom content, it's because custom content doesn't interest me. Like playing it. I'm a developer first and foremost, I'm not a player. Because every single time I tried to play stuff, including Antioch and similar things back in StarCraft 1, I could not get engaged in them at all. And this is long before I became a caster. This is long before I got into reviewing or critical commentary or trolling or whatever you want to view it as. I did not enjoy people's campaigns. The exception was if I knew individuals in question, I would usually at least give it a chance. For example, when StarCraft 2 was still young, I did a casting of The Signal. A very infamously hilarious cast, because I was encountering some very, very severe issues within that project. And I was held up for quite a long time with something that was not like super just very silly stuff. And most people who I associate with, that I do these castings for, or feedback for their project for, they understand my style. They understand that I am a very technical person, and I don't hold back in anything I say whatsoever. People who aren't familiar with my casting style, or people who are very sensitive, are going to more likely take great offense to every single thing I say, which, you can't win them all. And as a result, I have avoided doing any commentary or any feedback on anything unless it's specifically requested. I did do video commentary and casting for Antioch Chronicles some years ago. As I mentioned, there were several maps and several things that had changed in the maps. I'm going to discuss those in a few minutes. And I keep my commentary very terse, very to the point, and I'm as neutral as possible and as objective as possible. So what is objective in this sense? Objective is I focus on the technical elements. As I said, I was primarily there for voice acting. I didn't have any say on the script, nor did I want to have any say on the script. If they had asked me to do verification on the script and to change it as I saw, then I may have done so. However, the script was written by somebody who had an intent for the project in their view, and no matter whether objective or subjective, it wasn't my purpose to criticize or engage them in discussion on that subject. Similarly, when I am creating a project, nobody engages me on those because it is not something I open it to them. Because I believe that typically successful teams rely on specialized individuals. Individuals who are there to do a specific job or a specific series of jobs that are laid out when they begin that lends to their strengths. And the strengths of their ability to communicate with the individuals. Like I mentioned before, if I was, in control of aspects of this project, I would have done basically entirely the opposite of what they did do. Not necessarily because what I felt they did was entirely wrong, but because what I view as a project, especially for an RTS, is entirely unlike what they did. And because my strengths rely on those things as well. For example, AI and stuff is my path to building an RTS rather than relying on triggers. And that is why I focused 6 years of development time in StarCraft exclusively on the AI ever since the game first was released in closed beta. Now, I have avoided casting some projects I have been requested to cast. For example, Nehrim for Skyrim, I believe. On behalf of them just not looking interesting to me. Nehrim is a very, very large total conversion. It's very positively reviewed. I've never seen anything about it that looked remotely interesting to me. I said I would do it. I don't know if I'll ever do it. There's a few reasons why. First of all, I often feel that my commentary doesn't mesh too well with average modders because my tendency to focus on critical aspects is not necessarily very constructive for modders who are nonprofit and typically have very different values in their project than people who are seeking profit. And I have trained my eyes and my ears and my game style towards breaking things down based on the process of, assessing products based on, for example, when they were released, what their budgets were, how much time, what the conditions were for their publishers and stuff like that. A vast majority of which does not apply to custom content. And also because I don't like being a part of the audience of players for mods. I don't like associating with fan bases. I don't like associating with groups of people who play with mods. I prefer very closed development in general, which is why I only do it, or only used to do it, as per request from people that I knew. There are still people who are waiting for me to play their campaigns and give them feedback on them. And at this stage, I feel like they don't deserve what I am more than likely to say, because I am obligated to say it. I feel like that if you're going to review something, if you're going to play something, if you're going to discuss it, you owe it to the developer to give them your honest feedback, what you want to say, what your first impressions are. And this will lead to many different clashes, especially in different opinions, where people view things in ways, even if they're incorrect. It ultimately is what shaped their project and what will continue to shape what they actually do, regardless of what you observe or demonstrate. And I encounter this, of course, within Dungeons & Dragons. I've discussed this, I believe, in the podcast before. There's conflicts of interest and miscommunication and other stuff where two people can very ultimately just want the same thing. And I'm pretty sure that every single person involved in any of these projects ultimately wants the same things, regardless if they're developers or players. They ultimately want a relatively high quality project that doesn't cost them a tremendous amount of time and energy and heartache to make, that will perform admirably well and provide the players with a degree of engagement. The engagement is where you're going to go into more subjective things. I'm going to address this in a few moments. Feel free to hop in at any point, by the way.
Sure.
And engagement is really one of the things I want to really get into. Typically, custom content doesn't engage me. And there's a few reasons for that. First of all, most custom content is based on the official sources, the base writing the stories. And I don't find StarCraft interesting whatsoever because it's just a carbon copy Warhammer ripoff, and it lacks any of the grounding that Warhammer has. And Warhammer is pretty dubious in many ways. It requires a lot of turning off your brain. And Blizzard's writing is an absolute goddamn disaster. Anybody who's played StarCraft 2 can attest to that, but I would go as far to say even way back into Classic Brood War, it was a goddamn disaster. And the disaster started in large part with Kerrigan and stuff like that, where Blizzard tried to get creative. And Blizzard's not a creative company. If they've never had an ounce of creativity within their company, anyone who enters their company with the hopes of being creative is immediately rejected because it turns into marketing jargon and, checking off focus testing boxes rather than actually being creative. And StarCraft really is a testimony to that, with a very strong beginning, very, very strong visual storytelling, very, very strong engagement from everything except for the actual writing. And it very, very quickly goes downhill. And even a rudimentary, cursory glance at the instruction booklet that comes with StarCraft yields a colossal amount of inconsistencies and confusing head-scratching things. For example, the population of Terrans, which is only compounded by StarCraft 2. And within Antioch Chronicles 3, we see many, many similar things, which immediately start asking questions that can't be answered by the script or the campaign that we are presented. For example, how the Terrans are just able to bug Protoss. But also, when we are playing as Moloch and we are dealing with the Titans, as they're conveniently called, like every other similar object in every other similar game, there is suddenly an enemy fleet in orbit that demands the attention of our allies. An enemy fleet that was not recalled even though there was only one position of power for Nanoth Terradon to be at, this temple, that he most certainly knew people would eventually engage at some point, or had to have known. So you had this unspoken army, this unspoken space presence that was more powerful than what the protagonists had available to them, that engages the protagonists during only this period and not during when the Terrans are engaging with an extremely small force. The Protoss are forced to sit and lay back because of this psionic cocoon plot device, which is just conveniently there and conveniently disabled, all for the exclusive purpose of forcing you to fight with a 120 Terran food army, which ultimately doesn't even mean anything because most of the map is resolved with units that are spawned anyways. I'm just going to get into the engagement thing I'm going to talk about in a little bit. So all these convenient plot devices, they make no sense in the writing at all. And the Space Force that occupies your Protoss allies just disappears when convenient to begin the final mission. So the script writing, in terms of the world environment around you,
it's not consistent at all.
It's terrible.
No,
it's honestly terrible. Like it's terrible in the sense that you just didn't pay attention to it. Like you really to establish belief, you need to account for these basic questions everybody's going to ask. What happened to the enemy reinforcements that were giving us so many problems? There's mentions of Corsairs and Arbiters and stuff, but there's no actual resolution to that at all. Now, this is where I'm going to bring up a mission that I played when I was doing my early recordings. And I don't remember too much about it. I'm not going to bother to dig them up because there's not really much point. Too much has changed since then. But it involved you playing as Protoss, and you were engaging an Air Force. It was one of those maps where you pushed a button to transition between the two maps. One map involved your Protoss base. It was basically never threatened. It existed just there just to waste your time to build units. And you just put units on a beacon and they get sucked up. And then you had to go through a shmup kind of area. Your units passed a horizontal portion of the map from one end to the other while avoiding enemy projectiles and going into their thing and attacking stuff while these were spawning projectiles. So it was one of those gimmick maps that was really tedious. And ultimately they must have agreed because it didn't exist in this version of the game. But you had something very similar with the Dark Templar stealth portion, which you ordered a unit to move by extent of a button press and transitioned between two maps rather pointlessly with a button press. I will never understand why they bothered to do that. It was as if they had to come up with an excuse to use this thing they had developed at some point, even though it actually didn't offer anything to the game at all. And this is a consistent we would see throughout the Antioch Chronicles 3, is we engineered something and we have to come up with an excuse to use it because otherwise our time was wasted. It was as though that they were trying to develop systems for things that didn't need systems because these things that didn't need systems didn't actually exist. And so their development time was oriented more or less towards coming up with systems and then trying to justify their existence rather than making maps and then justifying the creation of a system for that map. Therefore, you had gimmicks that had no reason to exist. And so we shoehorn them in where possible because, well, we have spent time developing this gimmick, so we may as well use it somewhere. Except none of these gimmicks were creative. None of these gimmicks were anything but gimmicks. And the gimmick is named so because it's there as a distraction. Antioch Chronicles 3 is really heavy in the distraction department. We spend a very long time either blindly auto-attacking bosses, which occasionally make indicators for us to right-click our units to move out of, or build and destroy maps, which ultimately don't amount to build and destroy so much as they amount to build and auto-attack into things that ultimately don't interact with us from an RTS standpoint. So they're not really even macro maps to begin with either.
Yeah, I want to really focus on the idea that not only is this campaign, not an RTS by any stretch of the imagination, not using RTS concepts even, aside from a scant few missions, it's not really any other single genre from map to map either. Like, I talked about this, obviously, when I was talking about the fact that nothing is really consistent. It's a very schizophrenic. So the characterization we get is certainly a problem in terms of the story, like you were talking about the world building earlier, but we can't even really start to pay attention to that until after we take a look back, because we're still trying to adapt to the gameplay. Like, it really does come down to how the gameplay tells your story. And one thing that I was consistently talking about, especially with like the final boss battle, for example, where the Archons are just fucking strewn about doing nothing because they're like pathing into doodads, which is so hilarious and just so unintentional. Like, it's so obviously a bug that, like, you play the map once and you see and you correct, hopefully, but clearly that didn't happen here. That tells me that these Archons, these forces of Nanoth Tyradune, are not worth respect. And by extension, Nanoth Tyradune himself, the main antagonist of the entire campaign, which of course was not set up by the first two campaigns, so feels very much like a random shoehorn, ham-fisted addition or whatever to give the campaign some sort of direction. I guess they didn't really want to include like a brand new character or something, but they sort of did with Severak anyways, even though he was referenced before, but he wasn't actually shown. So very much like a construction of this. You could have just made Severak the actual guy, the actual antagonist, but he doesn't even get revived or anything, so it's kind of just pointless to have him in there. You could have just replaced Severak with like any other plot device, like reviving Amon or some bullshit, and it actually would have probably been more grounded since we played StarCraft 2, as opposed to just including Severak in there for, just to as like a tired connection to the second campaign. But anyways, like, Nanoth Tyradune does not feel worthy of respect. From his 7,000 dead units in the MOBA map to the Archons that sit there doing nothing, none of it feels like it's actually natural. None of it feels like it's actually there. And so even though you have no RTS gameplay, you don't even really have MOBA gameplay either, because half the fucking maps are broken in some way or shape or form. And the gameplay does not tell a very good story here. It does not tell us that our enemies are worth respect. We're playing on the hardest difficulty. There was like one map I had to retry over and over, or two maps I guess I had to retry over and over again. The really laggy one, and then that really silly defense mission because I got lazy with my hero. And so at really no point do any of these maps even feel like they're telling a consistent, coherent story with whatever, sort of circus show gameplay they choose to get. Like, it really is like a carnival ride almost, because like the gameplay just changes genres so frequently. And you were talking about
the problem we see a lot with commercial games.
Yeah, but this is definitely like doing. Dialed up quite a bit. Just probably because there was nobody really focusing on one aspect of the gameplay. Like, I haven't actually played Nier Automata, but you called it like a carnival ride. This feels like a carnival ride to me. This felt like a very big carnival ride to me, where nothing was consistent whatsoever.
And that's why I wanted to talk about the engagement thing. So typically, at least when I, was brainstorming a myriad of iterations of a campaign, and then revising them and critiquing them and breaking them down, and occasionally building concepts in StarCraft 2 to test them, you're looking from an engagement perspective. So say we have a map and we ask ourselves, what do we want out of this map? So in Apex 0x01, it was an FFA. And of course, the tutorial map I talked about in the podcast, that was my way of weeding out casual players while breaking into more of a standard game. But the initial part, as I explained, is literally just a binary. If you are a casual, you cannot play this project, and I'm making sure you can. So, I had a very simple, aggressive features of those maps. It's an FFA map. It's a team map. This is a map in which you have bosses occasionally attached to things. This is a map in which I introduce a Zerg race. This is a map in which I introduce a Protoss race. This is a map in which you play as this race, so on and so forth. This map is recreation of Armageddon onslaught, basic stuff. And then from there on, I let the RTS gameplay perspective play it. But I also wrote out many myriad projects for other genres as well. For example, ARPGs. So DMC-styled ARPGs. So in one thing we say, okay, so this is the introduction to the ARPG. We're going to start with some dual fights, and then we'll have an explorative section, and then the next part we'll deal with this boss, and it's mostly based on personalities versus personalities. And each map had an engagement design behind it. So in Antioch Chronicles, the way I think of it, if I really wanted to review just the gameplay, and just focus on the gameplay, first I break down what our experience was. So when we first started the campaign, we were introduced to 3 independent cinematic maps. And there was really no reason for them to be split up into multiple maps. That didn't really make too much sense to me. The context between the maps was also between the previous campaigns.
I think the reason why they were split up into different maps is probably because they felt like it would be too much for one map to go on for 20 minutes of a cutscene. But
well, that hasn't stopped anyone else.
Not only that, but it still amounts to the same thing, just with more loading screens. So you actually pad the runtime even more. It's really silly.
There's a variety of things I want to talk about just in regards to that alone. So I feel like there's a variety of things we could have accomplished within this campaign by actually having less cinematics and less perspective switching entirely. But obviously, we had a cast of characters from the previous campaigns, and we needed to actuate their participation in the story by adding in the next chapter. But we could have done so by just having the one perspective. Let's say, for example, Termalis, and say ultimately being up the driving force for a large portion of it anyways, we could just focus on Termalis. And focus exclusively on Termalis and his position and parts. For example, while Moloch is infiltrating, we focus on Termalis' air engagement. That's one example. But also, for example, while the Terrans are doing their own thing, we focus on Termalis exclusively during his aspect, and then the Terrans show up. We would have to rewrite a large portion, but it's probably for the better anyways. But the thing is that's not what we do. We start the campaign with a variety of very, 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 very fast cuts between a variety of different perspectives that are very, very, very abrupt. And as I mentioned before, we're not really given the opportunity or the desire to really connect with any given characters. We're told, hey, there's these 2 people and they have a relationship, and I just roll my eyes because it's just another amateur trying to write romance into something that doesn't have to be about romance. Because for some reason, it's a fad to have romance within things like RTSs and space operas when they don't belong. And it's something that when you opt into, you're obligated to providing a very, very, very strong and good reason why you're doing it, which never seems to be the case.
Well, that subplot in particular was really stupid because it wasn't even really resolved. It was sort of a focus of a couple of missions, and the fact that like he reconnects with her in, I think, the second mission, the second Terran mission, after the destroying all the Protoss and just destroying everything in the entire facility, even though they're supposed to be our allies or something. I don't know. That whole mission was a mess too. So it's like sort of a focus in some respects, but at the same time, it doesn't feel like a real...
It's very forest.
Yeah, like it feels like it was included because it was supposed to tick a box as opposed to being a natural inclusion. Because again, that character, that girlfriend, is not referenced in the first 2 campaigns at all. She's actually new to this production. Yeah. And that's why the first cutscene exists, is so that they can basically retroactively implant her into the story, and so that they can literally... It's just an exposition bit to explain to you what's happening with these characters. And I think I talked about this I talked about it somewhere. It might have been a podcast, it might have been just privately when we were talking about this campaign before we started. It might have been during the first 15-minute forward that we had at the beginning of the first video. But either way, I think that the one thing that you could definitely say about that subplot is that it really doesn't bear any fruit at the end. It feels like, he could have been defeated by literally anybody else just by being 1v1'd or something, by Moloch maybe, or even have Mox or Termalis. Like, this guy's had dealings with a lot of the other characters in the first 2 campaigns and obviously in this campaign as well. And to make it so that it has to be the love interest feels really silly to me. It also really, like, when they say that they love each other at the end, when he just fucking 9/11s himself off a cliff for some reason, on top of everything else, like, it doesn't feel like there's a payoff there. It's not like they were holding out on saying those words, because I'm pretty, they had said it several times before anyways, like in that opening cutscene, for example. So we already have this established. It's not like a twist, or it's not like this heart-wrenching moment where these characters that want to be together can't be together for whatever reason. Like, nothing about their relationship is actually, mixed together. It's not actually developed in a way where it feels like this is a satisfying resolution to these characters. And she just fucks off with a Protoss at the end anyways, so it doesn't even feel like there's a lasting impact. I guess there's a lasting impact in the sense that she feels like she has nowhere to go, but she was already in a position where she had nowhere to go. She got fired from her last job and went back and killed everybody. So it's like she already feels like an outsider. She's already explained to be an outsider by her characterization.
There's a lot of convenient cop-outs in this. For example, the death of Grape Drank Stukov. Somehow,
he just dies from
just have a cannon.
That was I think that was a reference to something in the first 2 campaigns, but I honestly couldn't tell you. It might just be some random shit that they forgot to explain. And the thing about that Nova character, Haley, that I forgot to mention is that I was told by Church that Lucid Iguana said that they wanted to do a genre inversion with this, with how normally the male loses his girlfriend or wife or something, and that's to spur his character on and develop his character further. That happens. So that's the motivation, I guess, for making it so that Trench dies as a result of the love story, and only the power of love could dispel the bond of Nanoth Tyradune, which really is still unexplained. It's still a massive
not even knowing it, because I knew that stupid cliche was coming. It is so tired and done, so uninspired, and so boring.
Yeah. So
there was nothing moving, and it didn't even change the character in the end anyways.
Yes, because at the end of the day, you could still have the exact same thing with him dying under the, his character essentially dying when he was resurrected by the eyes, which feels really forced and is actually never used again, by the way. I guess it's intimated that that's what the eyes are doing. They're trying to resurrect Severac at the end, but they don't do it. And it feels like, what is the purpose of showing us that it can revive things if,
the eyes are ultimately the most inconsequential key to the end of all things we ever have in such a campaign.
Yes. They
make some grape drink units that we can kill with something we just apparently conveniently reverse engineered. They revive a Terran of all things who kills himself, so their control over a Terran is very, very weak. And they make ghost Protoss, I suppose, towards the end, which are destroyed with conventional weapons anyways. So it's a very, very slapstick writing at the best of times. Its strong points are where, again, the case with many games is where it's not trying to be elaborate, where it's just trying to be down to earth and not really trying to extend over that. But the exchanges in large part feel very academic, is a good word for it. And academic is because it's what you expect to be written. It's the safe way out. Character is going to say X and Y. We're going to throw in some humor here, or at least an attempt at humor in the case of this. And nothing really risked in that sense. But the engagement perspective, our game design surrounding that is very haphazard at the best of times. So in the path that we played, we first started with a Protoss, and we went on to doing the Moloch infiltration. So Moloch was, at that point, propped as our, at least temporary, protagonist. And Moloch sets our pace for the micro maps, in that we have that first map, which probably could have just been deleted and you really wouldn't have lost anything at all. It was touched up since I played it, and that the defense portion was reduced by about to maybe an eighth of its length, actually. And
yeah, that's really puzzling.
Still very easy. It was very, very short in this version.
It's almost like they timed it out such that you couldn't... Remember that I lost Krillion's Corsair in that map, and he just vanished, and I didn't get defeated. So it's not even functioning.
It was very, very strange decisions. But then they kept those stealth missions, and I really specifically mentioned many times how easy and effortless they were. I had even less of an effort doing it than you did. I don't think I ever used other units. I literally just went through the whole thing, killing every single thing in my path just because I could. Even in the ship, I literally killed every single pylon, cannon, and unit, and it's quite possible because of my feedback that they decided to make those cannons invulnerable. But it ultimately had no impact anyways. It just prohibited you from killing them.
It probably made my playthrough faster since I didn't end up bothering with them.
Yeah. And the puzzles, you spent much less time with the puzzles than I did because, well, at least the door puzzle, because I am absolutely terrible at puzzles. But the puzzle map, as I said, is very, very heavily over-engineered. A lot of time most certainly went into making that and making the user interface. And again, while it's quite impressive from a technical perspective with something like StarCraft 2, that energy ultimately doesn't amount to anything because from the engagement perspective, all the puzzles are identical. They're all sequence puzzles in which you do one thing. You try to guess your way through doing that one thing because that's all you really can do. And then that's it. And then you're done. And you don't really feel particularly accomplished because especially the last puzzle is largely about being vague rather than actually about thinking things through. In the ideal puzzle word, you have information that you can use to break through something and figure out what's going on. But in that particular thing, since it was a very, very out of context sequence, in which you just kind of have to guess, you somehow splash an object. Now, if you were using like a siege tank or a raver instead of a scout, maybe guessing splashing something and blowing it up that way would come to you more naturally, but not with a scout.
Or if the antimatter missiles had like an explosive shell associated with them when your probe dies to them the first time, and it seems like they sort of fire haphazardly and explode visibly, then maybe you would piece that together through trial and error. But that's still not like an intelligent way to do it. I don't think you'd have to
really much focus on reads in this.
No,
so that plays into later on where we just have indicators everywhere. The laziest possible way to design a fight is to put red indicators on the ground. That is basically you admitting you don't know how to actually integrate ability activation and reads into the engagement. And so you're just going to have the game forcibly tell you not to stand there. It's just as Simon says. And really, I've got to ask why you're bothering to make an RPG if you're not going to have role-playing in it. Because role-playing is about decision-making. Role-playing is about getting into the character and embracing the character and being the character making decisions. But there is no decision making when there is a red circle on the ground that says, please don't stand here. And even then, those indicators ultimately being not that punishing at all. So we go through a variety of missions which ultimately amount to either sequence puzzling through running around opening doors and other sorts of crap like the Terran mission, or macro maps that are thinly veiled as sequence puzzles anyways because they're not really macro maps. And it brings us all the way down to the final map. And I wanted to talk about this because this one actually did change a fair bit from when I saw it.
Yeah, so there's an extra phase at the end of the boss battle there where he throws in some
the boss
units.
Battle, you remember when we first fought, I guess it was Severak, and there was indicators everywhere, but guys were fighting eyes off to the side. That is actually what the map was originally like, the final boss. And you couldn't die on it. Yes, but they changed it. They added indicators. So before, there was phases of him summoning statues, and then you fought those. The running back out of the grape drink was the thing. Your stuff on the side, the eyes are basically just there shooting lasers, nothing really big. And I think it actually took less time, even though it was still very lengthy. I can't get over how much health these units had. It was absolutely mind-blowing that you spent 34 minutes auto-attacking the same fucking units to death. I can't understand. Like, did the difficulty just add, like, 30,000 health to them? Because that is bizarre. And at the same time, you were in no fucking danger of dying except for the Dragoon, which you really would only die if you just decide to alt-tab out of the game and start looking up gay porn or something for a while. If you start like trying to find, goatsy expression expeditions, because you have a stun that just basically says, you don't do anything. I'm just going to kill you for now. And then you did, and nothing happened. And half the ads never engaged you. You could manually paint pathing things so they don't get hooked up on doodads like that, but they didn't. And it is bizarre seeing technical issues like that coming out of that Moloch mission with the mini games, because a lot of effort went to the mini games and the UI and stuff, and the technical things of that. We saw very few bugs with those. They all seemed to operate correctly, and nothing really major happened with them. But then we go into the final mission, we see some of the most like deadpan shit of units spawning and just immediately getting stuck wherever they spawned, and in which there was. They redid all the terrain for that area completely. It's completely new terrain for that. Completely new boss fight for that. And then the basic features of the ad spawning don't work. It's very, very strange. Coming out of Antioch Chronicles 3, just being an observer and focusing largely on the technical elements, and probably just coming off as a complete asshole in the process, it just felt really mismatched and schizophrenic to me. Like, to me, as an observer, and with my limited experience playing other projects, this project doesn't stand out as being particularly below or above the crop. It's just the average to me, because the average to me is people not testing things, not really caring about voice acting enough, not really doing anything in terms of audio editing, and relying very heavily on third-party assets that very clearly didn't have that much quality control to them whatsoever. And at the same time, demonstrating that they have the skill to remedy all of this, but not doing so because they either decided they'd release an alpha as opposed to something that they took a long time to actually polish, or because they just stopped caring. And it's really probably a combination of the both. This, like I said, this is a long project. This project spent an eternity in development, and a good chunk of that was waiting for people who didn't want to communicate, being Zeus Legion, and also because of technical issues that prohibited people from working. I'm very sure that the individuals working on this would have very much liked to have polished it more than it is. I doubt you'll find any people who don't. But
yeah, I think the most frustrating aspect about this is the fact that we know that they are capable of doing the things that they didn't do in many missions, because there are some missions that aren't fucked those ways. So they've done things correctly. They've done lighting correctly, for example. It's like a huge one. And they've done, like, not all of the lines are configured to use 3D positional audio, for example. Like, there's so much shit that they could have done that they did do in certain respects, and that's what lends to it feeling schizophrenic as well, is because sometimes they do it correctly and sometimes they don't. So it seems very like ad hoc too. It's like very chaotic, like it's very scattershot, I guess is a good way to call it, because it doesn't actually feel like there's a rhyme or reason. Like, every single map has some series of massive issues, but they're never the same kinds of issues. It's always like some issues are universal and then other issues are, more unique to individual maps, like especially the lag from the bullies, presumably, in that one mission is like obviously a big standout. And of course, the lighting in several missions is really, really awful, but especially that color palette one with the Warcraft 3 assets is horrendous. And, maybe you can try to reverse engineer something there and say, like, oh, maybe it's because there was a last-minute change related to the plot and colonialism and whatever. Like, there might be some explanation. I'm sure there are explanations for a lot of the fuck-ups here, but at the end of the day, it comes down to not spending enough time polishing stuff. And we know that this was a campaign where the developers felt, at least the project lead, Lucid Iguana himself, felt compelled to, rush shit out the door instead of taking the time to do it. And I do want to mention that you say that this is like neither above nor below average for custom content or just content in general.
That I've seen.
That you've seen. And that's like the key distinction, is that the vast majority, I think this is probably the only, I guess there's probably a handful of campaigns that have voice acting. The vast majority of custom campaigns do not have voice acting in them. They don't even bother with that. They don't bother with custom UI of any kind. They don't bother with cutscenes in the cinematic editor of any kind. And say what you will about how fucked up those things were in this campaign, at least they were there. There was some intent. Yeah. You can see the intent there. You can see that they're trying to do something. They're trying to, tell some sort of story, even though it's horribly disfigured. And looks like it was just a burn victim, basically. Especially that one where the guy is just fisting this man and throwing him on a shrine. That was so insane. I can't believe that was a real thing. And, so there's stuff like that. And, I even though we mocked Warpblade throughout the entire fucking project because we were comparing all the cutscenes to it, even then I can still see that there was some effort put into it. You have to understand that there were man hours that went into that sort of thing. It's just that at the end of the day, there weren't enough man hours. There wasn't enough man hours focused on polish as opposed to just creation. There's a lot of stuff that's just blatantly unfinished in this campaign, and I don't know. It goes back to the user interface. Like, some stuff is technically interesting. Some stuff is even good in an objective sense, but it falls apart from the assembly. From like when you look at it from a high resolution sort of perspective, and you step back a little bit and take a look at everything in mass, you're going to see a whole lot of shit that you really wish you didn't see. You really wish that they had spent time correcting a lot of the issues that end up plaguing this project and making it so it's impossible to get immersed in any degree. And I don't know, man. This is probably the best StarCraft 2 campaign, and it's this bad.
Yeah. I mean, I hold no illusions that nothing I say will ever fall on anything except deaf ears. But
no, I think there are some people who...
I was entertained. I was entertained by you dying over and over and over again.
Yeah, that's pretty good, I think.
You got to admit that, you this being entertained in that respect. At least I sure did.
I think that this will be...
That's really all you can ask for.
This will be an entertaining run for many people. One of the things that I will say is that there are probably a handful of viewers who watch mostly for entertainment, and I understand that, obviously, because sometimes the stuff that I say and hear, people link me later, and I'm like, holy shit, I don't even remember that, and it was pretty funny moments or whatever. But at the same time, even the people who are watching, the very few people, maybe a handful of individual single-digit individuals who are watching this stuff, looking for the analysis, trying to piece together some way to improve their own design process, or at the very least look at an example of a StarCraft 2 project that I guess you can call complete, even though a lot of the stuff within isn't actually finished.
I mean, you didn't run into a bug that prohibited you from completing it, so there's that.
Yeah.
It's not God of War Ascension yet.
Yeah, well, apparently I'm looking at the patch notes, and we got it just in time.
Patch notes did have some pretty severe stuff in them.
Yeah, I guess the most recent patch occurred, and it corrected Loriok and Krillion's switched models. So I guess they just didn't even have the correct models for this entire time until just recently. So there's stuff like that that's like, I don't understand how you could possibly miss stuff like that.
It could get fucked up by patches. That's the problem with StarCraft 2, and is shit, the data just gets completely shuffled. You can't think of StarCraft 2's data structure as like Brood War. It is a completely new dimension of incoherence, and things are linked together in ways that are just not obvious. And when Blizzard just starts going willy-nilly changing stuff, if you weren't very, very strict in how you started your project and made the data structure and avoided using third-party dependencies like mass recall, you can get utterly blindsided, and even then you can still get blindsided. Like I said, when I was doing stuff and I got hit with the Legacy of the Void in particular, I basically had to redo and unit test every single Terran and Zerg and Protoss structure that the AI had access to, because every single thing got fucked up.
Well, I want to say that we talked in the first video about responsibility when you're working with StarCraft 2, as opposed to something like Brood War, where the limitations of the engine are a bit more constricting. And even then, you can reverse engineer a lot of stuff. I think if you're working with StarCraft 2 and you're serious about making a project, reverse engineer the game and freeze the version. You got to do that. Yeah. You can't not do that, because now somebody will have to be on the ball fixing all of the things that Blizzard breaks from now to the end of time, or this project will just not be playable. And actually, our playthrough, along with a couple of other YouTube playthroughs, will actually be the only way people can even experience it. And that is really sickening. Obviously, it's not a good thing that Blizzard has done this. It's really shitty. But that's the fucking bed that you make when you decide that you want to make a campaign in StarCraft 2. And if your project is in StarCraft 2, you're going to have to support it forever unless you do that reverse engineering stuff. And I guarantee you it'll be less work, less time, less whatever effort, all this stuff that you have to do to get that done. It'll save you a whole bunch of work and headaches in the long run, because, you just won't have to work
with it, though.
Nobody will, I'm sure.
Nobody has the drive to do it. Nobody has the
drive. Well, it's the same reason, up until very recently, where we just didn't even have functioning AI in Brood War until we just, got somebody who was able and interested to do the reverse engineering and hooking required to, hook a bunch of shit in Rust.
It's unbelievable, the shit that I had to deal with in Brood War.
Yeah, Zerg just not seeing eggs.
As messed up as these games are, I really have to hand it to people like a Zerg guy who have the patience to go through StarCraft's editor to do this. I did a lot of stuff in StarCraft too, but most of it was R&D, and it was unbelievable. It was horrible to use that editor. To go through the editor and to actually make something functional like those user interfaces, I have to applaud your patience. You have Herculean patience to deal with the slowness and the bugs and the load times and all this other shit. It is unbearable, absolutely unbearable. And I say that, and I dealt with fucking Soft Image XSI and Sins of the Solar Empire and that fucking Convert XSI thing that literally consumed months of man hours on trying to solve failed vertex checksum with no indication, when it really was 3ds Max metadata all that time that the Convert XSI didn't know how to deal with. And it took me a year and a half of non-stop work. And then I finally discovered it towards the end of that. And that is horrible. And StarCraft 2's editor is way worse than that. To go through that and to make something like this that is functional enough that we can actually sit through and actually finish it, that's an accomplishment. It may not be well polished, but you can stand proud and say, hey, you made something in StarCraft 2. And that's something that even Blizzard really couldn't do. Because Blizzard had way more bugs in their shit than this did. And... like, for example, on Heart of the Swarm, the infestor noises and burrow or roaches or some
injured roaches able to burrow, regain health.
Forever. Like, you didn't have bugs like that. You perform better than Blizzard. Shit's janky, but you're using Blizzard assets. So that's what you get. But there's also stuff like the lighting. Like, you need to really look at this shit.
There's things that were deliberate, that were done deliberately by the design team, as opposed to just being byproducts of Blizzard or something.
I don't understand
Mass
at
Recall.
the same time how you can make something so technically impressive, go through all that, and then make maps that literally burn out my retinas. I have two entirely different monitors, both of which are like professional quality monitors, and on neither monitor was that video pleasant to look at. It was horrible. It was awful. Yes, I have some mild color blindness, but it's nothing really that severe. Some reds like Blood Mist in World of Warcraft are particularly hard on my eyes. But these maps were so bad, like the battle with the eyes, that I couldn't look at it for any more than a few seconds. And don't use post-processing to do that. Don't ramp up the bloom. It doesn't make it look edgy. It makes an already difficult to read game even harder. And you can't even see the fucking health bars and shit in those maps.
Oh, it's so hurtful.
Like that's the stuff that really drags us down. Like, yeah, the voice acting wasn't professional quality, and there's oddities with animations and stuff, but it was the intentional things, I feel, that really held it back. And that's what I take away from this campaign, is take all things in moderation, especially when you start going out of the way to try to over-engineer stuff. And that lighting is over-engineering. You don't need to ramp up the bloom and drop down the frigging light for the units and then ramp up the contrast to make a map appear like nights. You just make it nights. It's very simple. Very simple. You over-engineered something that didn't need to be over-engineered and made it very unpleasant as a result.
Yeah.
And I'm going to leave it at that. It's 3:33. Nothing I'm going to say I'm going to make any sense at this point. And I hope you had some laughs at the very least. I know I did.
Yeah, I think that the cackling at the tree in the first video in particular is spectacular.
I will never forget the astonishment I felt when I saw that Treant model enter the screen.
It slowly shamble its way from left to right.
Sliding over like fucking Elvis Presley.
Just destroyed some primal.
The entire
ultralisk.
context of the scene really set it up to, if your attempt was to make a funny, you have scored in ways that I have never seen any comedian accomplish. That is ace work, my friends. Ace work.
Yeah, that was I think the last thing that I'll say is that, it's a kind of a microcosm, that one cutscene, of a lot of the issues that this campaign had in general, where they were trying really hard, and that's where the over-engineering came from. They were not comfortable with just basic shit. They were really uncomfortable with the stuff that they were creating, and it was just
This is
so
one
obvious.
thing. This is one thing that is always recommended. Before you make a 3D game, make a 2D game. For one, it's simpler, much less complicated. And two, the things you learn sticking in those restrictions are going to help you a lot when you work up into something in 3D and it becomes really complicated. As StarCraft 2's problem, that didn't have anybody in it who had any idea what they were doing in a 2D game. You hand that team a 2D game, they're fucked. And Brood War was a fluke, and make no mistake about it. So StarCraft 2 is horrendously over-engineered. Nobody in it understood the fucking game. And producers thought it took, 3 High Templar to make an Archon. Like, people just made wild decisions without actually knowing anything about it. And they walk into something that has, like, the thing is when you have more power to do something, you feel obligated to exercise that power to do something when that something is probably unnecessary entirely. And that derives you into making over-engineered solutions. And over-engineering and feature creep go hand in hand. And that is most certainly a contributor to things being incomplete, is things get out of hand and you over-engineer solutions.
I think for sure one of the things that happened in this is similar to what happened with Laconius when he was. Yes. I remember him on I think a Campaign Creations podcast, back when those were still made, talking about StarCraft 2, how he felt compelled to use all of the height manipulators and all of the different terrain functions and stuff, and it's. I thought nothing of it at the time because I was like a kid at that point. I was like 15 or 16 or something. I hadn't even been banned yet, so I was still a very young lad. And
you weren't a toxic, manipulative liar yet.
Yeah, exactly. I had not yet tilled the ground of the social graveyard and placed my stone upon the turf. So yeah, it had been. I wasn't a dumb bitch yet, so I was still hanging. And I remember taking note of that anyways, because I figured that's probably the same way that I would be. I was already sort of feeling like, at least, without making custom assets and stuff, I was at the limit of what I felt like it was possible to do with Brood War's like very, very limited terrain and stuff. So it would be a while before I bothered making custom assets to remedy this situation, even though it wouldn't fully remedy it anyways because of the nature of Brood War's isometric terrain not being like texture-y like Warcraft 3 or StarCraft 2. But I think that one of the things that this campaign did the least in terms, like, was probably its terrain in general. And it goes back to the idea that, like, I need more time, need more polish. It's pretty important to characterize things properly. And I think that a lot of the environment wasn't characterized properly, but they certainly felt like they needed to use all the things that they made throughout their tests. Like you said, I actually am surprised to learn that they didn't end up using some of the things that they used in their test maps, just shoehorning them in there for the sake of it.
They changed quite a bit. Like the eye fights, the first eye fight had a bunch of void zones. Like there was moving wormholes, and you stood in those to avoid damage. And I ended up giving them about an hour long or so, 45-minute analysis on those fights. And I feel like maybe Azurgai did actually take some of those to heart, or maybe Lucid Iguana even took some of those to heart. And they made some adjustments to those, and I felt that that was some significant improvement. Still too much health on those units, and the fights were still very easy. But
yeah, you could have ramped up some of the...
There was a lot of stuff that didn't really get addressed in the same way, like the terrain and lighting and stuff like that.
Yeah, so it's weird that their focuses were so disparate. I'm surprised that they didn't bring on some more terrain-focused individuals.
Especially when you are stuck in like an echo chamber, and you're just starting out, like these guys most certainly were, having that alternate perspective can really help you reorient yourself. But there was similar analysis for other maps that didn't get used, and I feel like that they shouldn't necessarily treat my words as like some kind of iron rule that you got to follow in order to be successful. But
because if it were up to you and I,
implied from them, I think they should have reassessed a lot of things that they were doing.
Yeah, if it were up to you and I mean, obviously the project wouldn't have any micro missions, for example, or they would be significantly different. So
I would focus on using, like skill shots and stuff, and making the micro missions about duels, and I can think of like a variety of different ways I would redo that Archon fight. That would have you running around and projectiles and stuff moving around, and you avoiding danger zones, and then attacking differently.
But I like the idea of having terrain interactivity or something like that, but they did it in a very shoehorned way where it was
really
like,
weird because
either it killed you to not avoid it.
Nothing happened.
Yeah, well, I think I just sequence broke or something, but like either you avoid it or you die, or it's not consequential enough to even warrant the APM necessary to avoid it, and you just sit there and take it because the damage values are so weird. So, yeah, it just goes back to things being over-engineered.
You typically want to be targeting like a 80 to 100 APM average in a mission, because that's like the bare minimum to really keep your attention. And it's when your attention really starts drifting that stuff is going to become really grating, like the repetition of the voice lines and stuff like that is really going to be noticeable all the more when your attention drifts. And if you're not using your APM, like a casual player can very easily hit 100 APM. It's just you got to figure out what it is the casual player is actually good at, or at least give them a learning curve to latch onto. But since this campaign was so inconsistent in what was actually like constituting as being confronting the player, like either being a puzzle, which is turn-based and static anyways, or the tug of war in which you literally can't do anything 90% of the time, you're waiting for a cooldown anyways. The requirements were very, very wildly out of control anyways. So like I said, engagement really comes down to that. And when you look at engagement, you ask, what is the player actually physically doing at any given point in this map? And if any of that answer is waiting, I think you need to redesign the entire map.
Yeah, it goes back to wasting players' time. They could be doing so much more with their time than playing a custom campaign for an obscure dead RTS title like StarCraft 2.
Yeah.
They really don't need to be, having their time wasted and strung along like fucking farm animals or something.
Like, a lot of people don't like cinematics. There's been an extremely large number of people who told me that they hate cinematics, don't run Metal Gear Solid 4, etc., 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 etc. I don't mind long cinematics. I don't mind a 15, 20-minute cinematic. I played Xenosaga, and I like that game. And that game has more cinematics in it than any custom campaign you're going to find put together. There's literally like 40, 50-minute cinematics in some parts of that. And that's okay, as long as they're engaging, as long as they're delivered well, as long as they're interesting, as long as the content is relevant, then you can get away with that. And I don't mind that whatsoever, and I'm not going to think something should be reviewed negatively just because they decide to have story in it. It really depends if the story is any good, like Last of Us is an example how not to do it. And I think Bulletstorm is an example of how good to do it, because those cinematics were relevant and interesting, and the dialogue was written well and delivered well.
It was very tight, Bulletstorm. It was very snappy. And I think that leads to the idea that you can have cinematics, but they were really misused in this campaign because it just stops you from being able to play the game temporarily.
There's lots of parts where they interrupted gameplay.
Yeah, and you never want to, my idea of a proper setup, unless you're really changing states in the middle of a mission, in which case I have to question whether or not the second state should just be its own map, if it's not something that's really weird and over-engineered, like what we've been experiencing for most of this campaign, for example. Maybe there's a reason you're changing states. Okay, maybe you can have a cutscene that bridges those two things. But other than that, and the opening and closing cutscenes, there really shouldn't be something that interrupts gameplay for the sake of the story catching up. You
can make it hard to tell a story, but you gotta ask, are you really that invested in telling a story? Why are you bothering to make a campaign in the first place? Because the gameplay experience is ultimately what is going to shape players' experience of the campaign. The more disruptive you make that, the more likelihood you're going to have a hard time delivering your story to begin with.
I just feel like I was really hoping for something very different from this campaign than what we ended up getting, and that both of us have experienced when it comes to custom content. I have a bit more experience with it, especially recently, because it's basically all I've been playing lately, besides a couple of titles that are probably worse than a lot of the campaigns I've been playing, like Dead Space, for example, is really horrible. But when you look at something like TAC 3, I was really hoping that we would experience something that understood how to tell a story using a game, at least in some way, and they never really allowed their gameplay to, take center stage long enough for it to be consistent and for, it to not be interrupted by a cutscene. So you never really got the feeling that the gameplay was telling any sort of story in the first place. It was actually very much like, the story has to catch up eventually, go play some gimmick minigame stuff, and once you're done, we'll talk about what the story has to say about this. And
the need to throw in gimmicks and to delay and to put in stuff between things, again, very academic. It was like somebody pulled out some college textbook about how to design a game and tried their hardest to follow it to a T without actually really thinking about why these games don't actually work.
Yeah, I think that
this was it felt sterile.
Yeah.
It was like you walk into a hospital and you smell that chemical smell. That's what this is like. It's sterile. Because it's really just trying to tick off check marks and trying to follow that academic design.
I'm just so surprised that this is how far they went with. Like they made so many maps, they made so many cutscenes, they put so many years of work into it, and it probably felt a lot longer than it was. But we spent more time in this, even if you cut out all the idle time, all the chatter time where we were just reviewing what we had just played, essentially, like giving our thoughts on it in those extended post map and pre map discussions. If you just count the game time, you total that up, is more than the average AAA title that has a single player component. And well,
most of it didn't amount into actual content.
It was just padding, as we discussed.
It was not content.
Yeah,
it was really like 10 minutes of actual gameplay in this entire thing. You've got the sequence puzzles, and then you've got running around, and then you've got aim moving through units, and then you've got using abilities on cooldown. And we don't change that formula when we first start until when we set it down.
Yeah.
And none of the characters really change that much. Tormalis gets voided, and that's...
He doesn't feel like a different character at the end of this campaign than he did at the beginning of the first one, let alone the beginning of this campaign. Like, there's no arc there. That's really weird. Like, you would expect the main character of the entire campaign, the one
I wasn't really sure, like, what is this even about exactly? Like, what was actually the campaign about?
It was about Nanoth Tyrodion trying to revive Severak with the eyes of the fucking Xel'Naga.
But the eyes don't do anything.
Nope. They revive Trench so that he can have a subplot.
A handful of meaningless characters, as far as I'm concerned, die. And
their deaths are always pointless.
Glorious deaths.
Yeah, it's like they don't even mean anything. Like, you could have actually just cut Trench out from that map and nothing would have changed. Like, the story didn't get impacted by his death at all.
He should have just died where he died.
Yeah.
And that should have been it.
And even then, more meaningful. It was presented in such a jank-ass way where he's just shooting this guy while going, uh-oh, better run. Get out of here while you can.
Not at all alarmed that he's about to possibly die.
Yeah. And then fucking Broker just executes
he's a very
him.
materialist person.
Yeah.
We established that he's a very materialist person.
It would actually be somewhat interesting.
Not at all concerned he's about to die.
Yeah, it would be interesting to see him give all that up to save Haley, right? His supposed love interest. And I guess that sort of happens. But then Hare and Mox just sit there 10 feet away from the fucking Void Man Nanoth Tyrodion himself, walking up to this hybrid broker guy. It's just Stukov with cheese. Or without cheese.
It's just like...
oh my fucking lord. I can't believe that they just showed back up. Like, they might as well not have even left that cave that entire time, because they were in the same exact spot when they killed him with a cannon that was never explained.
There's so many... I'm reaching that point of tiredness where I just am gonna start dying laughing to every single thing. Because he's made of grape drink and he turns into a hybrid when he dies. Yeah. He's using a hybrid death model.
There were so many portrait, death model inconsistencies.
Like, I gave them... Let's see, what did I gave them all the particles I think I'd made.
No.
And then, like, one of them was a Protoss explosion.
Well,
and you can tint those through the actor.
And that... Stukov... So that model is based on Stukov. Stukov has a death model. I'm pretty sure he doesn't just explode. Certainly doesn't have a fucking hybrid death model. No, he didn't, but you could still just
I think
copy the keyframes, right? Can't you just copy the animation steps from that model that it's based off of? And as long as the bones are weighted correctly?
Take a generic explosion and color it purple. Like, the thing is none of these people in this project had any idea what they're doing with graphics, but it's so simple to take that XML converter that the guy had made and then convert these models that you want to use into XML and change the texture paths to a texture you've opened up in XNView and hue shift it to purple. But it's actually even simpler than that, because I'm pretty sure you can hue shift it inside the data editor as well and just make it purple. So just take a generic fireball and turn it purple. Okay, it's not going to look fantastic, but you're not going to have a hybrid appear there either. So it's like kind of like really simple stuff like that. Especially when you're like focusing on trying to set you presumably going through a lot of effort with the actors to set a mood for a scene, and then you don't even bother to change the stuff that's really right in front of you that really pulls you out of the scene. You gotta like reassess your energy, your resources, and your penises. Especially your penises. You gotta reassess your penises. And placing them inside of your assorted locuses.
Just
so N.
Fist a man and throw him on a shrine, why don't you?
Yeah, that.
Oh man!
Like, I think back to Brood War and all the jank ass shit I've seen in Infoceptor and that infamous Boeing 747 model I used for a transport in one of my older mods, and all the shit that I did to put graphics on those mods, editing JPEGs of Command and Conquer, using MS Paint to paint on player color in scribbly bits. Rendering my first renders out of Rhino 3D, like some of those you saw would have done and the Hawk, they turned out very grainy because the way Rhino 3D rendered them without anti-aliasing. And then the renders for Armageddon Onslaught, the ships, and ITAS, in which the lighting I think is from a fixed angle, like all that I considered irredeemably fucked up. And none of that remotely compares to the things I've seen in StarCraft 2, because people do stuff in 3D and they're evidently not very good at it. But they don't like even try to hide that. Like those videos I recorded of those models I downloaded that are just it's more effort to fuck it up that way than it is to just do something halfway and not very well. Like it's literally more effort to do what they did. Yeah. Like I scratched my head wondering how they even like ended up so far off the beaten path into Slenderman territory that they ended up with models where the entire texture is shifting around the whole goddamn thing, and everything is dislocated. There's multiple treads rendering each other. Like what process happened? They ended up in that. And then you look at like the cinematics that we saw in some of this stuff, where there's like a wiggling Protoss heads on all the models. Like, how does that actually happen? Like, I don't even understand how that even happened. Like, it's a model on a still frame, but the heads are still moving. Like, every time I saw that, I would just lose my shit.
I still can't believe the amount of low-resolution models we zoomed into as transitionary objects.
It's very Blizzard. Certainly very Blizzard. We gotta get those low-resolution objects on screen. Like, I don't understand.
Well, get treed.
Get treed. It's 3:53 a.m. and I have a lot of work to do today.
Well, better get to it.
I'm gonna get to sleep is what I'm gonna do. Smoke weed.
N.
All
right, so Mesk and I decided to record our last, final thoughts separately, and this will be the final portion of the review. Final time you're going to hear from me. The final word will be going over to him. So thank you very much for making it this far in the production. I hope you enjoyed the commentary. I hope that if it wasn't educational, it was at least entertaining. Obviously, there were a number of points where we just paused the progression of the campaign to talk about some subjects, particularly at the end of videos, but also at the end of the first video, but also, in between missions and stuff, we would do that. And I think that I want to take this moment to discuss the community behind StarCraft 2 custom content. And there really isn't much of a community. The player base for these custom campaigns, right? Your audience, if you are a StarCraft 2 content developer. First of all, you're not using Battle.net. Because you're not using Battle.net 2, which is actually 0.2, because it's just a massive step backwards from Brood War, which was obviously not suited for custom content anyways, because anything you needed a mod to grab, it had to be disseminated differently. you'd think that maybe StarCraft 2 would be better suited for that, but not really. The arcade has some serious file size limitations, and I think the only way you can get around that is by purchasing new licenses of the game, which is its own degree of insanity. So let's just talk about the fact that you're going to be hosting all of your files offline. You're going to be probably using SC2 Mapster, even though it's been stillborn ever since its creation. It never really kicked off, never really went anywhere, and now to get an account on that website, you have to link a Twitch account or something silly. Like, you must own some other account in order to register an account for your Mapster, which is, that's obviously going to make things very difficult, very inaccessible. And accessibility is something that you have to consider, I suppose, if you are aiming to get your campaign played by a vast majority of people, or at the very least exposed to a large number of people, right? Because there's YouTubers like Jay Barino and Deltron who will actually play your production and share this project with people who maybe don't even own StarCraft 2 or don't have it installed, because it did go free to play recently. So you don't even need to own the game if you want to play something like the Antioch Chronicles. So you'll get people who signal boost your content, hopefully, if you play the right political game behind the scenes. And I think that a big sort of issue with the way that the StarCraft 2 community is that if you're not making something on the arcade, then really the only thing that you have in terms of an audience is other developers. And you don't want to alienate yourself from the single area that you have to take a look at, right? StarCraft 2's engine is really fucked, poorly programmed, and the data side of things is just so ass backwards. And so it's not really like anything else. So no past experience is really going to prepare you for working with something like the data editor. The best thing you can get is some knowledge of how XML works, and then just do it all externally through, Notepad++ or Sublime or something like that, as opposed to touching the data editor at all, because it's so slow. And even if you're willing to look past that, you still have the problem where the game doesn't even support real-time strategy gameplay, because the engine is, I guess the AI specifically is really fucked, right? So you look at the challenges that you face when you start working on something in StarCraft 2. You have to ask yourself, why am I making my campaign in StarCraft 2? Just start with that question. What do I need StarCraft 2 for? Why can't I make this in Brood War or another RTS? Now, but before it was AI-related issues, actually, is that even though StarCraft 2's AI was really garbage, you with enough research, with enough R&D, you could get to the point where you could at least do like 1v1s or 2v1s or something. Anything past that would slow modern machinery down to a crawl, because of the way that StarCraft 2's engine is, handling all of the AI bullies and stuff. We saw this in The Grey, which was the second mission played in the second video. So there's obviously going to be some serious issues with performance when working with AI. But, you could still make something functional. And Brood War AI was not really that well understood until recently, nor was it well, designed. We actually needed to improve engine functionality. You still could have gone in and done the work necessary to understand and improve the Brood War AI. But say that's beyond your, sort of scale of your project. You just want to take an engine based on its existing merits, then, okay, sure, maybe the AI is something that you can work with StarCraft 2 with minimal R&D, if you're making something very small scale. And Antioch 3 was pretty small scale. We never really got really large maps, with the exception of The Grey. We never really got anything that was remotely close to what you would expect out of a large-scale RTS campaign. And I don't even think we rivaled the scale of the original Antioch campaigns as well, for that matter. Although I think there's only like 2 maps in the entire... I think there's 1 map per production that had multiple AI. And that would have been the mission where you have Nanothyrudin's Protoss allies in Antioch 2. And then in Antioch 1, the finale had multiple AI. So aside from those two, we really didn't have much large-scale missions in the original 2 campaigns. So I guess it's fitting that only 1 mission in Antioch 3 was remotely large-scale in that respect. I guess what I'm getting at here is that there's a lot of technical issues. Just looking at StarCraft 2 as a platform for custom content, it basically isn't one. And you have to really destroy the platform, the content that you're trying to make. You have to really sort of make it contort and conform to the limitations of the engine, or you have to pick another engine. There's really no other way around it. That's where you get all these people who are making RPG maps and these weird arcade modes and tug of wars and stuff like that. They're not really making RTS maps because StarCraft 2 doesn't support RTS gameplay. Ironically enough, it supports gameplay that isn't RTS a lot better. With some terrain work and some data work, you can make stuff that looks and plays relatively reasonably. For example, I think there was even some weird experimental shit when StarCraft 2 first came out. I think maybe even in beta, there was like one of those tower defenses. Those are what they're called. You could tell I haven't played the game in a while because tower defenses are basically the most popular thing about this title. That and Tug of Wars, Desert Strike, Nexus Wars, whatever. And so you take a look at there was like some tower defense that was done without any triggers. Like there was these units that were pre-placed on the map, and they had behaviors that would spawn them in or make them do certain things or something like that. And obviously, the towers themselves that you're building are all done through behaviors as well. So they're basically, I guess they've found a way to do it. And so data can be a very powerful tool. StarCraft 2 itself can be very versatile, and just not in the ways that you want if you're trying to make an RTS campaign, right? If your goal is to make something that performs well and is a performant piece of software and also happens to be RTS, then StarCraft 2 is not your platform. Generally speaking, if you want something that performs well, you're not going to be looking at StarCraft 2 anyways, but you could at least maybe make something work if you're dealing with small-scale stuff, if you're dealing with stuff that isn't RTS, etc. So I would have far preferred that Antioch 3 had gone whole hog and tried to make a micro-campaign. I feel like the RTS inclusions were very confusing, thematically disconnected with everything else, although they weren't the only things that were thematically disconnected, rather. They were certainly things that stuck out probably the most. And yet they were included, I think, probably just because it was a sequel to a campaign that had macro missions. So that's not really justification for why you would make this campaign have macro missions, but I would have preferred that they, really polished up their user interface, made it so that all of the UI that they made were consistent with one another, and that they had gone ahead and done the necessary work to make their micro missions feel not like lazy RPG missions where you're just moving through stuff and not paying attention, like Mesk thoroughly summarized in the after the defense mission that also had that weird, find the Cerebrate subplot going on. So it was like the first playable mission that wasn't a prologue. So that's a long time ago. Anyways, outside of that, I wanted to mention that all of the critique that I have here, it has to be colored by the idea that StarCraft 2 is not a proper, sort of platform for deploying custom content. And I recognize that. However, these individuals at Team Antioch still made the decision to make custom content with StarCraft 2. And that is their first mistake, for sure. That is their responsibility, then, to make sure that StarCraft 2 is the only platform that you could have used to make something like Antioch 3. Now, I understand that the original, Antioch Studios actually had no real desire to make the third campaign in, still in StarCraft. They actually had rewritten the lore to completely remove it from StarCraft and tell their own story, and it was going to be about like Antioch and stuff like this. It was completely different. I'm curious as to why nobody decided to try to make something in Unreal. Maybe there was an issue with proprietary nonsense. Maybe it was just because the people who were interested in making Antioch 3 were just interested in making it in StarCraft 2, but it's not a platform for custom content. We've already gone over this, so I won't labor that point too much more. What I will say, though, is that, again, your audience, if you are designing for StarCraft 2, is the other developers. And again, nobody really wants to play the bad politics game where they, say something that alienates themselves from the entire fledgling community that comprises StarCraft 2 Mapster and the various discords that you can find people in. And I think that's a real shame, because I feel like there's a massive issue of stagnation Really, the only things that turned any heads about this project were the fact that it had cutscenes, although they were very silly, and the fact that it had, what would you call them? I guess interesting user interface designs. Even though, they were functional and they took a lot of effort to make, I'm sure, they didn't actually contribute anything positively to the production because everything was very thematically and, I guess, presentation-wise, was very disconnected, right? So it had some elements that were, you could say, groundbreaking. You could say set it apart from other productions. Obviously, it had voice acting as well, which is a nice addition, even though the voice acting itself could have been a lot better. I think just looking at it honestly yields a lot of problems, and you should talk about these problems. You shouldn't gloss over them. You shouldn't ignore them just because, you don't want to alienate people. You don't want to hurt people's feelings. No, they should know. You should respect them enough and respect the craft of making an RTS production enough to tell them where you think they fucked up. The craft of designing a game, right? If you respect that, then you should respect any hobbyist's effort and your own integrity enough to say what you really think about this production. And I feel like there's a huge issue with this fledgling community that basically doesn't fucking exist anyways, that they're so afraid of hurting each other's feelings because they're the only ones who play each other's maps anyways. And they're, I don't know, but I think that's really it. It comes down to a communal feeling where they don't feel connected enough if they start critiquing people. And they also are worried that if they say what they really think about things, then maybe other people will say those things about their projects, and they don't want that for whatever reason. I don't feel like these individuals are being particularly honest when they, don't speak their brains about their own individual misgivings about a particular project. Like when they don't talk about how everything's fucked with the cutscenes, when they don't talk about how, the gameplay is completely thematically disconnected from everything else that they've played, and every mission introduces new gimmicks and new silliness, and the cutscenes are all fucked, and the characterization could have been a lot better, and the voice acting needs to be improved, and hey, can you do some additional retakes? Like, when you look at the problems that we've found in the third episode of the Antioch Chronicles, when you look at this campaign, I think the only way it gets to this point where it's released publicly, available for consumption, had more bugs in it when it released than it does right now, actually. I think the only way that it gets to that point, that it and still gets released, is if developers are willfully ignorant of their own problems and no testers and no quality assurance individuals are paid any heed or have the balls and the gusto to come out and say what they really think. This is what happens when nobody speaks their mind honestly, or are just ignored if they do, and ostracized if they do, right? That's what happens, I think. I think you get campaigns like this, that while, yes, they have some respectable qualities and redeemable, aspects to them, they do not carry their own weight, and everything else falls apart because of some seriously fucked up elements, like lighting settings, bloom, whatever, cutscenes being fucked, storyline being completely uninspired and also unbelievable at several times. There's some serious issues with, the construction of this campaign from the ground up that you won't be able to fix if you're not really honest about what you feel needs to be done. And, you add on to Mesk talking about at the, I think the end of or the middle of the first video, something like that. He mentioned that there was a time-based pressure. And I recognize that scheduling, it can be tough, and working on the same project for year in, year out can be tough, but if it's not done, it's not done. You don't release it until it's done. You don't release it until it's polished and everything feels connected and everything feels consistent and just cogent in general, that the themes don't clash and that the story isn't completely unbelievable and all these other problems that I've elucidated in the gameplay, in the commentary, as well as in this review. I feel like there's no way back for the Antioch Chronicles without a massive overhaul and rewrite. And if you wanted to do justice to this pet project that you guys have in your heads, you should have done that. You should have been honest with yourselves. You should have recognized that that there are some serious fuck-ups, serious mistakes within this production, and that they need to be resolved if you're going to be able to sleep with yourself at night. And I don't understand how these individuals sleep at night knowing that they produced this. They must really have been fully indoctrinated into the belief that developers can't be lazy and that they're doing Todd's work with this liberal arts degree stuff. But I see it very differently. I see that this community will not produce anything of value, anything that doesn't feel like a massive waste of the player's time, if they are not willing to be honest with themselves about their work and about each other's work as well, honest with other developers about what they think. And right now I feel like you're caught in a massive feedback loop if you're in this ridiculous community where everybody's saying, just sucking each other off, basically, talking about how good their projects are and all of the good things only. In many cases, citing horrible things like cutscenes and, really poorly choreographed and poorly animated and poorly, what would be the other one? I think choreography really sells it, really. Just everything is really off in a lot of elements. The cutscenes are a good example because they're just so thoroughly fucked. I don't think there was a single one that was intact that didn't need some serious revision and serious editing. And if that doesn't get caught and fixed in development, how do you expect it to get caught after you release it? Well, you would expect it to get caught after you release it because you'd expect people to actually hold you accountable for what you'd produced, but they don't. And that really sells it right there, I think. That really explains why this community is essentially beyond redemption. Again, I don't hold any individual person on this team or person in the community, in contempt in any respect. I just see it as a massive waste of potential and waste of my time as well as theirs. If they're not willing to be honest with themselves about their own products and about the products of their peers, then how is anybody going to improve? And how am I going to ever be able to play a competent production out of that scene? How is anybody going to be able to play it, right? So it's better for everybody if everybody else is honest. And yes, you can temper that honesty with a little bit of social class, but that can only take you so far. And it certainly is. There's not enough honesty going around right now. There's not enough hard-hitting analysis that is not accompanied by, countless sort of qualifying statements that prevent developers from being able to say, oh yeah, my feelings are really hurt, so I'm not going to, listen to anything else you have to say. There's so much of that. Anytime anybody has anything negative to say about something, they have to first cite a bunch of positive things and then say, I know this doesn't, I know that this is a negative thing that I'm pointing out here. I know this is a criticism, but please don't, take it with a grain of salt because there's all these other good things about this campaign. I've heard that fucking lie countless times. I don't think people who say that and know what they're doing respect what they're, playing. And I don't think that people who say that and don't realize what they're doing and actually believe what they're saying and aren't just outright lying to people, I think those people are, potentially salvageable because they can be educated. But the other people, I think, are just poisons. And they must be excised from my social graveyard. So let's find them and exhume them and then have ourselves a little snack. I'll leave it to Mesk to wrap this up in the proper way. Mwah.
And so closes up Antioch Chronicles 3 and my spectatorship therein. And there's a few last final thoughts I wanted to add to the review, particularly since at this point in time it is not 3 a.m. and I'm not actually halfway or 3/4 way asleep. So evidently I was very, very tired during the majority of those recordings for a variety of reasons, and therefore I may not have expressed many of my thoughts very clearly. Well, it's a struggle to say I'll express my thoughts clearly even when I'm actually awake. But that comes with the job, you see. Sometimes I think of abstract things in my head and they really don't come out quite like they should. But, well, that comes with the job. You can't really just rewrite who you are, or what you say, or how you say it. It really doesn't come. You can practice, and I have been practicing for many, 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 many years. But, well, there's some things you really just can't quite scrub out. Some stains you can't quite eradicate. But there's a lot of things I have learned during my time with custom content, ranging all the way back from the first Age of Empires and dealing with AI and campaigns, all the way to the present day, where I help a variety of custom private projects and some commercial ones as well. And amongst all those things, I've talked about consistency, I've talked about, intent, I've talked about goals, I've talked about the things behind the scenes. So when we look at custom content, be it, from the legendary Flame Knives to the now legendary Antioch Chronicles 3, we end up collecting in a whole different kind of experience than just, my usual fare. I usually focus on commercial, because commercial software all reaches the same point. It's supposed to be of a quality worthy of its price tag for its day and age and compared to its competition. And it's supposed to represent then modern understandings and advancements of techniques and, technology and performance and stuff like that. So we always have a very, very strong cornerstone from which to review those productions and address a lot of things therein. But when we get into the custom content arena, everything becomes quite a bit more nebulous because, well, there really isn't much obligation on behalf of the developer to do anything. They're generally making a pet project. Occasionally you encounter some individuals who, by extent of claims they have made, obligate themselves to delivering some things. But there is also obligations associated with the platform. Now, Pornogo, when we first mentioned this, talked about obligations associated to StarCraft 2. And I'm not really 100% sure what he was thinking in regards to that. But there is a few things I would like to discuss in regards to StarCraft 2. And it really comes down to the whole consistency and time management and other such things. So this project features a very, very large prominence of issues that really aren't that difficult to fix. Lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of super basic graphical stuff. For example, like the lack of shadows and things like that. I had brought these up during unrelated cinematics. There was a lot of content that did get cut from this project. I did discuss the need for consistent shadow casting. So this is 2018, and the project I don't think was released in 2018, but this is 2018. And StarCraft 2 was released, I think, in 2010. Let me verify that real quick. I'm pretty sure it's 2010, but I want to be absolutely 100% sure. I'm pretty sure it's like the first or second quarter 2010. Yes, July 2010. My memory is not entirely terrible. So the thing is that in 2010, we had shadow casting very, very well established within games. Very, very well established. And just because StarCraft 2 doesn't really use shadow casting that well, especially in its cinematic environments, doesn't mean that we shouldn't take advantage when we can. So shadow casting is a really, really important thing because it helps set the mood, it helps ground characters and stuff in the scenes, and so on and so forth. Now you're going to ask, okay, all right, so why don't we have shadow casting within certain scenes? Because the lights don't have the flag ticked on them within certain objects. So we don't really see this in the RTS portion of StarCraft because the world light, there's 3 world lights, one of them casts a shadow. It's called the dominant light. So in 69% of cases, we're never going to really see a lot of issues with StarCraft 2 and shadow casting in the RTS view. When we enter the cinematics view, however, we have a lot more problems because some of these lights are not configured to actually do dynamic shadow casting. Now, StarCraft 2 does have some performance concerns with shadow casting. It's very, very, very hard for StarCraft 2 to perform well with even a few lights on the screen. But the thing is, with cinematics, you rarely ever need any more than a handful of lights. You're only viewing a small number of objects at a time. Suffice to say, performance is not really a concern, especially when we look at one of the maps within Part 2, in which we suffered about 7 to 9 FPS for about several hours. And obviously, performance was not really a concern on behalf of these developers, so we really wouldn't worry about placing a couple of lights within the scenes. I did mention that a lot of lights don't have these options ticked on. So to tick on these options, there's a few things you can do. You can, for example, just create a light within 3ds Max and use the exporter that Blizzard Entertainment released in, I believe, 2014 to export the light as an object and place it within the game. So this is something pretty much any person can do, anyone can do. All it requires is possession of 3ds Max. It's not exactly difficult to obtain, legally or otherwise. Furthermore, because you're working on a campaign, and generally speaking, when you start thinking about recruiting staff for the campaign, it's largely demonstrably complete, it probably wouldn't be hard to convince somebody who's dabbling or has access to these tools to create such light objects for you. So this is a case where you'd think, my scene doesn't look very good because I don't have a dynamic shadow casting light, but I'm not entirely 100% sure how to obtain that myself. Maybe if I ask around, I could find somebody who is able to do that for me. Alternatively, you can actually use an XML converter. You can convert the M3 format to an XML. You can change things within there. Now, one of the obligations that you walk into StarCraft 2 with is actually to make the game more readable. So StarCraft 2 shipped with a lot of very, very unreadable graphics because of incorrectly configured specularity settings. And there's actually a very, very easy way to fix this without having access to 3ds Max or anything of the nature. You use the aforementioned XML converter. You convert the files to XML, you go to the specularity lines, I believe they're at the top of the file or very close to it, and you just adjust the numbers until the specularity highlights are not quite as heavily contrasted. So what this will do is this will remove the super sharp binary contrast on, for example, the Zerg units, where they turn into a lot of specular noise. It'll flatten them out, they'll illuminate a little bit more realistically, and their contrast won't be so high that they turn into a sea of noise, like white noise, when they're bundled up, especially in certain lighting configurations. Of course, when we are talking about making these small changes to the model files, we're really expecting the developers to have, put a lot of thought into the way their scenes and stuff actually look. The reason why I'm bringing up these shadow examples and the specularity examples is because these are things that you would normally classify under polish. So, for example, when you're making a cinematic, one of the ways you may start to make it is with a storyboard, and the storyboard may just have some placeholders, and they use text-to-speech which I thought was quite entertaining, and time things out that way. And the storyboard is very, very rough. Its sole purpose is just to show you, hey, this is maybe the kind of camera angles we're looking at. This is what our characters are going to say in this scene, and so on and so forth. And then we will have a prototype, in which the prototype would have, renditions of our characters and stuff like that. And we work our way up into the beta phase. And the beta phase is where we start thinking about things like getting the shadows to work, correcting specularity, those kinds of things. So we always keep in mind early into development, what we want in our final product is obviously something that's relatively polished. And I think every single developer wants something that's quite polished out of their project, regardless if they're getting paid for it or not. A project is kind of like a representation of that developer. It's a representation of their ideas, the effort they placed in their ideas. Pretty much no circumstance is that project ever going to land them some kind of job or some kind of compensation unless they're doing it initially for compensation. For example, contractees working for Bethesda to make microtransactions is now a thing. But in most cases, you're going to find most people are doing things in their free time for a hobby. And in my experience, working with a variety of individuals of all sorts of nationalities and, cultures, pretty much every single one of them wants quality out of their end product. And pretty much every single one of them wants to take that end product and work with it until it reaches that stage of polish. Some people are going to get caught up on some things. Not everybody has an eye for detail, and not everybody really, really cares that much about polish. And that, I think, is okay. Because there's nothing that you can say as a third party that's going to really change the opinions of these individuals or how they work on their projects. You could try to educate them or whatever, but it's ultimately up to them if they actually want to get involved in improving their project or not. For example, I can teach you about lights and specularity as I just have, and it's ultimately up to you if you actually want to weaponize that knowledge and use it to improve the appearances of your project. In pretty much every case, you're going to find nobody is going to do something that they don't already do, unless they were actively pursuing education. But this is a very granulated thing. I want to look back at the project and look at something far more fundamental. The lighting configuration in multiple maps, in which the bloom was completely out of control, but the color brightness, the diffuse colors, were greatly reduced. So what you had was a very dark and then very high contrast, coupled with extremely over-the-top bloom. I would be led to believe that this is a bug, but the thing is my lighting configurations from all the way back in Wings of Liberty still work to this day. So I can't entirely believe that this is actually a bug. It's actually intentional. So in this consideration, we're looking at something that wasn't incomplete, like, for example, the cinematics without proper shadowing, but something that was intentionally done that was actually very, very destructive. So in the review process, especially when I'm looking at user-created content, I can't review it in the same arm that I would a commercial project, because the values and the goals and everything are completely different. But I can still assess things in similar manners by trying to judge what exactly was the developer intending. What resources did they have at their disposal to educate these decisions, and did they really actually put an honest effort in it? When I look at the lighting for this project, that's one of the things that really gets me. Now, it's true, I share with Pornogo a dislike for micromaps. I share with Pornogo a dislike for, overly drawn-out exposition or whatever. But in most ways, I'm actually far more lenient than him, and in many other ways, I'm far more harsher than him. And the thing is when it comes to custom projects, I'm willing to let pretty much everything slide. I'm pretty much willing to work with anybody, and of any nature, of any opinion of me, so long as I feel like that they are willing to improve and that they're actually going to produce something. In that case, I'm generally willing to help them so long as I have some kind of guarantee that their project is actually going to get finished. And I do have to admit that while I was working alongside this project, or at least observing it, I had very serious doubts that the project would actually get finished. There's a variety of reasons, from the aforementioned ghosting of Zeus Legion to the real lack of interactivity between individuals working on it. But they did eventually get it finished, much to my surprise. But it's not finished. I could go through a hour-long talk about why it's not finished, but as always, I prefer demonstrations to do my talking for me. Demonstrations are objective, they're infallible, and if an observer cannot come to the same conclusions that I have by extent of watching the demonstrations, maybe they should open their eyes. Although I really would also recommend against that, because opening your eyes while viewing this project may result in having retinal damage. Because that is what the lighting does. It gives you severe eye strain. It really, 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 really hurts to look at these maps. I have two different monitors here I tried to watch this stream on. One of them is an old Samsung. Here, I'll get you the model. Samsung SyncMaster 245T. The other monitor is a BenQ BL2411. So I don't think they're quite, professional studio quality monitors, but they are very, very expensive and have performed well. The Samsung has been performing well for a very long time, to the state I've even had the capacitors replaced in it to keep it running when they were failing. Because the monitor is very, very good. There's not really a lot of inherent flaws with it, the darks, for example. The point is that I have two entirely different monitors from two entirely different eras, and both of them have served me well in countless LPs, in 3D modeling, in assessing graphics, in video media, dealing with, encoding and color space analysis, even what's it called? Chroma, I forget what it's even called, but the YUV 420 versus YUV 444. I've done a lot of graphics works on these monitors. And I've dealt with a lot of high contrast and low contrast and all this shit. This campaign's map are some of the worst things I have looked at for colors. Not all of them are like that. Some of them are quite fine. For example, when you're fighting Zombie Trent and the little bit of Zerg that are kind of idling outside of him with Mox. That mission, after the Eye Cancer mission, that mission was fine. There's nothing wrong with that. The final mission with Nanos/Terradin fighting the Archon was fine. Fighting the Eyes was not. And if you just decide to turn off your brain and ignore all these things that are in front of you, well, there's nothing I'm going to be able to say to convince you otherwise. And really, my entire point in recording these rants is not really to try to convince anybody of anything. If somebody wholly believes that something is created and is of a super high quality and created with the utmost honesty, and that developers can't be lazy, well, there's nothing I can do to change their mind, and I have no intent of doing so. My goal is primarily to point you towards things within the demonstration, and make observations of those things, and at times try to assess them. Sometimes I'm wrong. For example, I didn't fully understand how LCDs handled brightness values and how much power they consumed with them. Somebody walked in and corrected me. That's fantastic. I learned something. I walked out of that a more wise person. But I do still understand that staring at these highly contrasted, very, very, very messed up colors in these certain maps caused me very, very severe eye strain. And that's something that is not an opinion. It's something that actually happened. And you know what? For some people, it may not cause severe eye strain, either due to their monitor configuration or because of their eyes. But when we look at things like shadows and specularity on top of it, things that were never addressed, there was no hint of them being addressed, on top of a script written largely with plot devices, some very, very poorly executed romance arcs that were entirely unnecessary, and one-liners that would make even Saturday morning cartoons shake their head in disappointment. Really, we got to start asking a lot of questions. What was it developers actually really wanted out of this? And I don't know. I never knew. I never once knew. I never had any shred of an idea. Usually I don't ask these questions, because to be quite honest, I couldn't care less what they wanted out of it. Because chances are it's something that really doesn't sync up with what I want out of it. What did I want out of this project, you may ask? Well, preferably, I wanted to take part in something and assist them in creating a high-quality product. Do I feel that I reached that goal? No, not really. I initially came on to voice Japak, and for whatever reason, I never even knew why they didn't use my takes. Maybe they weren't very good, but I think it was just because someone else wanted to do the voice for him. And as for the result of that, well, chances are you've seen it. That doesn't really bother me. The Archon, I could have done better. But it was alright, they accepted it. And then they had me add in way more effects than was necessary, and I accepted that too. Like I said, I wasn't going to call the shots, I wasn't going to contest something. I simply spoke my mind and said, well, I think maybe this is too heavy, but it's your call. And that's the way it should be. Because the thing is while you're working on a project, conflicts of interest are one of the things that will most certainly prevent it from ever actually being completed. As somebody who either joined out of their own free will or was recruited, it's really not your place to get into the head of the designer and design. That's not why you're there, unless it is specifically why you were brought there, to be a designer. Upon which case I have to ask, why the fuck are you there, and why isn't the designer designing the project? We get into a whole lot of deep rabbit holes asking questions about idea guys and all this other insanity. But the short of the shaft is that, I did my part and the project was completed, and I'm quite content with that. I'm really quite content with that. And I have no complaints. I have no desire to really extend beyond that. But at the same time, I wonder, why was this project released when most of the cinematics look like they're still storyboards? For example, just one of the example. Like, there's just a lot of basic things, like the units spazzing out when they're walking and stuff like that, and the sliding treants and stuff. That's all values you change with inside the data editor. Very, very simple values for the walk speed animations. Very, 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 very simple to do. I'm sure everybody on their team knew how to do it. If I knew how to do it, everybody knew how to do it. I was probably the least competent person in the entire roster. Literally no fucking idea how anything in that game works outside of, the graphics and the audio and stuff like that. I know how games work. I don't really know too much about StarCraft 2's data editor. And then you walk into maps like the Moloch, infiltration and the ship map, and you have all these, really impressive UI setups and stuff that looks pretty clean and executes very cleanly. Pornogo didn't run into any obvious bugs with him. It shows the age of StarCraft 2's graphics and stuff like that, but I thought it looked pretty good, considering this is StarCraft 2, and pretty much nobody would be, willing to work with this game, even if they were paid, because of how horrible it is. And here someone came in and made all this fancy stuff, and we had a UI that was very unnecessary, very, very, very unnecessary, switching around the minimap position and all this other shit is very, very unnecessary, but technically, something to behold. For certain maps, very specific maps, it's very inconsistent all over the place. But we have all these technical things, and then we have the cinematics that are very, very messed up, and lots of really, really basic stuff all over the place for like the walk speeds and the lighting and stuff like that is very inconsistent. And I think the big thing you've got to worry about when you're making any kind of project, nonprofit or not, is consistency. Consistency keeps you honest, I think. Consistency is one of those things where it really helps you self-improve. And like I mentioned at some points, really like what you want to walk out of something like this is tangible self-improvement you can reflect upon and say, hey, I did that and I learned something doing it. And, I did something in this project I had never done before, which was animations for an organic unit. And Labyrinth said that they were very Blizzard-esque. So they were obviously terrible, but, it was commercial quality because Blizzard got away with similar animations. So, that's like the lowest bar, but it was something I'd never done before. I'd never done animations before until this project. And I moved on and did animations in StarCrafts and, my own projects. Not really as advanced as some of the stuff I did in this. And then I animated the eyes and stuff like that, and it was something I'd never done before. Something I really had never really attempted before, and something that just came up in conversation, and I decided to do it on the spot, and I came out of something, and I'm quite content with that. I'm fine looking at Antioch 3 and being like, hey, that's the project I did some animations in. That was the first time I ever did animations. So I intentionally look away from any conjecture about, any of the elements about the project that are negative, and I focus on the positive. And I think a lot of people prefer to do that. I think a lot of people really prefer to just focus on the positive. And I don't really know why, because, criticism and negativity and all these sort of things, they don't necessarily all go hand in hand. It's not necessarily a bad thing that somebody has a good laugh about some janked cinematics or some really badly delivered lines or whatever. I think everybody sort of approaches these projects somewhat tongue-in-cheek. They accept they're not really being compensated for it. They know it's probably not going to be very well polished up by the end, and they know there's going to be some weird oddities that come up, and I think everybody can have a good bit of fun about that, but it is a learning experience. And the thing about learning experiences is you don't forge a productive environment focusing only on filleting people. If you make a project and you release it to the public and you expect just to be filleted, well, you're in for a surprise. Because somewhere along the lines, someone is going to tear apart your shit. Such was the case for many of my video productions. And many of those times, it was really quite eye-opening to see how problematic things could be. I've just gone through about over a year and a half of tearing apart my entire process of doing audio and video encoding and processing and really like relearning a lot of things and rediscovering a lot of things and really critically assessing my pipeline and the tools I was using and doing a lot of things I really wasn't comfortable doing because I had really gotten set in my ways. I'd really become accustomed to doing things one way, and change is scary. Change is very scary, and I had to adopt a new pipeline and a lot of new things to pursue higher quality media. It was all about achieving accuracy in colors and squeezing little bits of power out of the codec while not really keeping the file sizes, any larger than they need to be. Just quality assurance, quality control, just pursuing improvements. It's just sort of like natural things. And you look back on that and you think, this was just a natural stepping stone to improvement. Critically assessing things is a stepping stone to improvement. And at no point should anybody look at the very concept of criticism as attacking someone. And although I'm sure I come off that way because of my very aggressive nature of speaking, it is not my intent to attack anybody involved with this project or any of these custom content projects. I can't say the same for commercial projects because there's much different obligations involved with that, and there is real world expenditures involved with it, and people do invest money into these things only to get shafted. But that's not really the case here. We invested some time, but the developer invested a lot more, and I feel like the developer deserves honesty when it comes to review of their project. At the same time, I don't feel they deserve to be torn apart in the same nature. And that's why I don't bother to do so. It's why I don't bother going into the nitty-gritty. This isn't even really analysis. It's simply me speaking my mind when I feel the time to do so. And I hope in doing so, the viewer can open their eyes a little bit more as well. And maybe learn a few things, notice a few things they didn't before. When people are more educated, they're more capable of appreciating well-done content. And developers as well will see a marketed improvement in their own work when they understand how to assess and critique it themselves.